everybody. Hello, everybody in the room and in the Zoom. My name is Claire Gillis. I am also a member of the board of the Windham World Affairs Council. And I want to thank everybody for coming to tonight's talk. Before introducing our esteemed speakers, I'd like to remind everybody that the Windham World Affairs Council has been around for 62 years as forum for discussing international affairs here in Windham County. We are the smallest of the National World Affairs Councils of America, which is an independent, nonpartisan organization dedicated to engaging the public and leading global voices to better understand the world, America's international role, and the policy choices that impact our daily lives and our future. We are very committed to keeping our events free and open to the public. And for this reason, we rely on the support of voluntary public donations, such as you, to do this. And we get most of our support from membership dues and donations that we receive at these events. If this is your first event, or if you've been attending many of them in the past, we encourage you to join as a member and get to know this interesting and active group of international thinkers. Student memberships are free. Individual memberships are $35 a year. Family memberships are $50 a year, and lifetime memberships are $500. You can join online via our website, windhamworldaffairscouncil.org, or you can talk with a board member. Any board members in the room, please raise your hands. There's Tamara, Star, Lisa. And you can talk to them after the presentation. One of the perks of membership is inclusion in our monthly Members and Friends Salon, where members can meet our board and each other right here at 118 Elliott Street in Brattleboro. There's some wine and cheese. That is always delightful. Even if you're not ready to become a member, make absolutely sure that you're on our email list so you will get notifications about future events. And your membership also supports our youth outreach and mentoring programs, particularly Peace Jam, which is a new program we've started. We launched at Brattleboro Union High School in September of this past year with fellow board member Jody Williams, herself a Nobel Peace Laureate. I also want to tell you about our upcoming event, which is on June 22nd, 7 to 8:30 p.m. here at 118 Elliott Street and online. The optical physicist Jack Jewell will be joining us. He will share videos and photos from the time he spent recently in and around Antarctica, which is just great. He was on the icebreaker boat, the National Geographic Endurance, and will share his observations on geology, climate change, wildlife, and geopolitics. That is to say, the politics of a continent with no indigenous population and no military or political authority. As he put it, he will talk about not only animals' human-like behaviors, but also about humans' animal-like behaviors. So I think this is absolutely a must-see. I will also note that a talk on Antarctica will bring our organization's talks overall to a truly global reach, because that means all 7 continents will have been discussed in these forums. So I'm really excited about that personally. Again, that's June 22nd, 7 to 8:30 p.m., both right here and wherever you are in the world. And tonight, I am most delighted to introduce my friend, Dr. Tamara Stenn, and her cohort of fellow Nicaragua surfers, who will be speaking on surfing as development on Nicaragua's Emerald Coast. I'm particularly happy to introduce Tamara on this topic because we actually surfed together in Nicaragua while bringing in the new year, 2023. And she's much better than I am, but it was a lot of fun regardless, and fish tacos and beer afterwards, so that was fun. Tamara is professor of business and economics at Landmark College here in Putney, and she will be joined in this panel by fellow Nicaragua surfers, Dr. Jason Old, who is professor of history and Spanish at Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida, and Dr. Lindsay Usher, who is professor and program director Park, Recreation, and Tourism Studies at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Tamara Stenn.
All right, thank you, Claire. Okay, so here we are. We're going to be talking about stories of transformation on Nicaragua's coast. And it's really interesting the perspectives that we'll be bringing to you tonight, because each of us look at Nicaragua from a different perspective, right? Our common thread is we surf, we love Nicaragua, right? But how we look at it based on our different disciplines is going to be different. Okay, and that's what I wanted to share with you, a chance to kind of see how Nicaragua appears from different points of view. All right, so where is Nicaragua, right, and surfing? So sometimes people ask that question. So it's South America, right? So it's located right above Costa Rica, right after Honduras, and the region that we're looking at is what's sometimes called the Emerald Coast, which is also a problematic word because it was something coined more for like a tourism attraction. It's not a term that's used by the local people or really understood in Nicaragua, but it was a way that people were starting to imagine, how do we talk about, this region where there's so many different really good surfing beaches. So here you can see where Nicaragua is within the realm of Latin America. Okay, and one of the big reasons why surfing is so proliferate in Nicaragua is because we have these breezes. So over here is the Caribbean. So there's these constant breezes blowing in from the Caribbean over Lake Nicaragua that makes the waves that are coming in from the Pacific slow down. So the waves are crashing into the beach and the wind is blowing pretty steadily against them and making them go slow. And by the waves slowing down, then it creates a better environment for surfing. Okay? And the place where my experience comes from is Playa Madera, San Juan del Sur, which is down here. And then our guests are going to be talking more about the areas up more towards the north. Okay? Well, actually, they're Popoya. They're up here. Okay? Where they're surfing. So lots of different regions, all on that Nicaragua coast. Okay? So when you look at what is economic development, right, there's many different ways to understand it. One of the most common ways that economists talk about economic development is through GDP, which is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country. So if we look at GDP, for example, in Nicaragua, and then I used a comparison of Costa Rica, because Costa Rica is sort of the cousin of Nicaragua, a lot more developed as far as tourism, okay, also has surfing, beaches, but it's a different type of development that we have in Costa Rica, where it's a lot more expensive, right? It's a lot more developed, and Nicaragua is something that's still a little bit more rustic in its tourism. But it's interesting when you look at the trajectory of the GDP. This is Costa Rica, the dotted line. This is Nicaragua. They kind of mimic each other. The only difference was in 2018, Nicaragua had a drop, and that wasn't from the pandemic. They had a political situation where people felt unsafe in the country and started to leave. And then the pandemic came, and now things are picking up again. Okay, so we see how that kind of affected Nicaragua a little bit differently than Costa Rica, that was affected more specifically by the pandemic. But both of them are in upward projections as far as economic development and growth. And then if you look at, well, that's just money, right? What else is about people's well-being? Well, it might be their access to education, right? It might be their access to healthcare services, their ability to feel safe in their environment, right? Their ability to participate in governance and community development, their ability to appreciate and enjoy their own culture, right? Or feel comfortable in the place of where they are. So this is called the Leggett Prosperity Index. And what they've done is looked at many different indicators, okay, to measure where are countries, right, when we're looking at well-being beyond just GDP, right, beyond just economic development. So here they're looking at safety and security, personal freedom and governance, okay? And the way this shows is these are all the countries in the world. And Nicaragua is ranked as 114 on the entire index, okay? It's, and here we can see where Nicaragua is in relation to where everybody else is, okay? So this is where we have like the most safe and secure country, the least safe and secure country, right? And Nicaragua's up there. So it's kind of a nice graphic where it shows us where Nicaragua places in comparison to the rest of the world. And then we can see Nicaragua itself, okay? So the more rounded and full this little spider web is, the more complete somebody's economic development is. So in Nicaragua, they have very good health care, right? It's universal health care. Everyone can get, the hospitals are open to anybody that needs care. When we were there during the pandemic, there was vaccines available for people if they wanted them. Living conditions are also pretty robust, the natural environment and safety and security, okay? Education is something that's been lacking a little bit. The economic quality, infrastructure, market access, enterprise conditions. Nicaragua is the poorest country in all of Latin America, okay? So we can see there's some areas where that's being affected, right? We have a very strong central government, okay, that's also very controlling on messaging and how information is communicated in the country. Okay, and then we have social capital. So this gives us a little bit more of an understanding, what is Nicaragua, right, as far as development. And then if we go and look again, well, what about sustainability, right? So these are sustainable development goals. Does anyone know what those are? Sustainable development goals? Okay, so there's something that's been developed by the United Nations, promoted in many parts around the world. 17 goals that we're looking at, as a collective on this planet. By helping to work together to reach these goals, we can create a better world for everybody. So the idea is that, well, maybe my country might have zero hunger, or maybe we have good health and well-being. But if other countries don't, then that's going to affect the sustainability of the whole planet. Right? And we see that already with migration, right? People leaving when things are difficult in one place and trying to go to another place. Even here in Vermont, we're getting a lot of climate migrants coming to our places. People are coming from California because of the fires. People coming here from Texas because of personal freedoms, right? Feeling like they have a lack of personal freedom in Texas coming up here. So instability or an inability to reach some of these different goals can affect not just the country maybe where those goals are lacking, but also other countries as well. So that's why this is a universal project that's presented by the United Nations. And they rank countries, every country around the world is ranked on how they're doing and what they're doing. So if we take a look at Nicaragua, for example, but when things are red, that means that they're the furthest away from achieving the goal, then orange is closer, yellow is closer, and green is achieved. Okay, if we look at the United States, we're all red. We're not doing well. But here in Nicaragua, we see the climate action, they've been very proactive with that. They have a lot of alternative energy resources that they use. We have the no poverty is something that's been improving, even though it's one of the poorest countries in Latin America. It's still the people's degree of well-being is on a pretty even level. There's a lot of distribution of income, and there's a lot of government programs that helps to make sure that happens. We have the gender equality, responsible consumption. So we can see there's some areas that are being achieved and some that are still, working to be developed. Okay, so as we're understanding a country now, we're looking at more than just the numbers, right? How much money or how much product is being generated. But now we're kind of looking at, well, in which way, right? Where is work? Where are there opportunities? What is life on land and life below water like? Okay? At the end of this presentation, what we'll do is I'll be talking for about another 10 minutes. Then we're going to have our two guests also present their topics and what they've experienced in Nicaragua with more academic research. And then we'll have this open for questions and answers. Okay? So if I'm going too fast, let me know. If something that I'm presenting isn't making sense, let me know. And then we can just talk about everything also at the end. Good? All right. So if we take a look at the areas of development, so the World Bank, right, is a development organization that helps countries to be able to reach different goals. So the World Bank in 2018 committed $145 million to Nicaragua. Then we saw there was no engagement in 2019, 2020, and now 2021, 2022, we're starting to see engagement again. And the big areas that are being invested in is education, food security, so really being proactive in the face of climate change, making sure that there are systems that are able to withstand drought and different changes in climate. Adaptation of water supplies, right? Fresh water is something that's going to become more and more scarce on the planet. So how do we plan proactively to make sure that we have fresh water? The communications infrastructure, which I have better Wi-Fi in Nicaragua than I do here in Vermont. Okay, and one of the big attractions that we have in Nicaragua is the digital nomad. With so many people who are working online, right, working remotely, they can work remote anywhere. So from the pandemic, that really spurred on this idea of the remote worker, and it's maintained. So we have remote workers from all over the world choosing to live in Nicaragua because of that communications infrastructure, right? They're able to keep doing their work. Land administration, so a real push on the sales and ownership of properties. In 1 year, 28,000 properties were starting to get turned around, and they use GDP technology to be able to delineate where are the different parameters, right, on the different properties, who owns what land. And then we have public health care, and then catastrophe risk and recovery, right, because hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, right, all of those things can happen in the Nicaragua area. It's called the Ring of Fire where they're located. So, and this is a picture of some of the wind turbines. They have over 150 wind turbines that create about 17% of the renewable energy, okay, in Nicaragua. And again, those are those breezes that are coming over Lake Nicaragua, right, that are helping also to slow down those surfing waves. So they're a big source of energy as well. So my story, how I got involved in Nicaragua, I ended up going down there 3 years ago with Ian Diamondstone from our own community, who's a spice trader and also has a house in Nicaragua. And he said, come down, I want to show you what I'm doing, you might like it. Right, so we went down with our kids, and sure enough, there was a beachside house there that was for sale, half abandoned. I said, okay, we'll take it. So we ended up, and this is my little Airbnb, presentation of the house. So it was a plain cement house, and I started painting murals. So that was a lot of fun. So going down there, painting murals. When we purchased the home, it also came with a caretaker family. So now they've become part of our family. They also live on the property and take care of the house. And then my husband Jesse's a musician, and now he has his places that every time he's in Nicaragua, he's welcome to go and play at, the different restaurants. So it kind of made a pretty smooth transition into the country. It was pretty easy. And that's something also that's interesting, because that's one of the areas of economic development that Nicaragua is really starting to look at. How do they make themselves accessible to foreign direct investment, which is one of the big pushes that the government's having to help start spurring on the economy. The other parts of the economy made up of the refining of oil, right? So Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia are all countries that work together in alliance, the Bolivarian Alliance. And in that way, Nicaragua is processing a lot of the oil that's coming out of Venezuela. So they have that refinery, they have that relationship. At the same time, Nicaragua is starting to work with Costa Rica to develop a little bit more of its tourism. But it's interesting because a lot of the Costa Rica tourism comes to Nicaragua to escape Costa Rica. Okay, because Costa Rica's gotten so populated with its tourism that it's kind of lost that local feel of culture. And a lot of people are now coming to Nicaragua for that local culture. So these are this is the beach down the road from me with the little seaside, restaurant, which is owned by Nicaraguans. There's two different restaurants here. They're both owned by Nicaraguans. The Nicaraguan fishermen go out and catch the fish that are then cooked up and sold at the restaurants. And this is the surfing beach, and that place is owned by my friend who is Australian, but she married a Nicaraguan. And it's the Nicaraguans' land. So the Nicaraguans don't own beaches. No one's allowed to own a beach. They're all public. but you have land that can be close to the beach. So she married into that family land and set up that surf house, and that was about 12 years ago. So she's been there for quite some time. There's another little surf restaurant. This is my neighbor with horses. You can rent a horse and ride on the beach. Okay, and then this is my husband Jesse at one of the local hotels, Happy Hanukkah. So there's also, we have Chabad there, and there's a big Jewish community also, especially of soldiers who finish their studies, their work in the military in Israel, and then they come to Nicaragua to relax. So there's a real international crowd. We have a lot of Canadians, especially in the area where I am. And we're always having travelers coming in from France and Germany and Australia, different parts of the world. Some for the surfing, some just for the yoga, right? Where I live, there's a lot of yoga retreats, the nature, relaxing. A lot of people are traveling with children, families. There's homeschooling, but we also have Waldorf-style schools. And even the public schools. A lot of the people have kind of teamed with the public schools to create kind of hybrid schooling, where it's a little bit sort of Waldorf, hands-on, but then also the more traditional Nika curricula. So there's a real mix of collaboration in my part of where I live, which I think might be kind of unique to my corner, to the corner of Nicaragua that we live in, which is Playa Maderas and San Juan del Sur. Here's some of the fishing. So these are my neighbors with their little skiff. They built that themselves. It cost about $7,000. And that's their livelihood. They go out every morning, they catch fish for a few hours and bring it back, sell it to the restaurants. Sometimes they'll go snorkeling amongst the reefs and get octopus and get lobsters, right, to also sell to the restaurants. Sometimes they'll take folks out on their boats. Okay, and that's the father and that's the son. So they've worked together to kind of develop this fishing. And this is the way families work, right? They have the boat, they'll bring it down to the beach, and it's a supplemental income for the family. And here we are celebrating holidays together. This is the family that lives on our property. That's their house at the front of the road. Okay, and one of the areas that we have is the work from home, right? We have that really good Wi-Fi. Then we have Claire visiting, helping to paint the murals. Okay, and we have a lot of people that come through to do that kind of work, right? International people looking to connect with the world using that Wi-Fi. This is called the old, and it's what I wanted to show is like historically when I was talking to my neighbors, what was this land like before the surfing developed, right? So my neighbor's 30 years old. What was it like when he was a kid growing up in this region, and it looked like this. They would grow corn on the hillsides, alongside the beach. They would go fishing in the mornings, and they were pretty much self-sufficient, right? Corn, beans, rice. They make the tortillas. They grow their own rice and beans. And that's pretty much the Nicaraguan way. And a lot of this coastal land was just, sometimes used for grazing, sometimes for horses, sometimes for agriculture, but it wasn't really developed land, right? There's howler monkeys there and a lot of other just natural environment, right? And little by little, it's been getting opened up with more development going in. This is very common to see someone using their cows to pull their cart or the horses. Okay, even though a lot of people do have cars. And this is where you see sort of the transition, the different ways of living. So here we have the old Nika houses, right, kind of like shacks. It's a very temperate climate. You really just need protection from the rain, just so it doesn't fall on your head. So you don't need, glass windows, and you don't need, very secure doors. It's not like Vermont. But we have some very basic shacks that people live in. That's their full-time housing. Right across the street, we have a piece of land for sale for $85,000. Okay, so we have this real contrast at this point. Here we have a traditional Nika house with all the vegetation, and it's made out of cinder block with wrought iron. And here we have a new modern development right across the street. Okay, no trees, parking for cars. So again, sort of this contrast of development that's starting to happen where my experience has been. And the last thing I want to talk about a little more is this idea of the ecotourism, right? If we look at projections in the future, what's the future, right, for Nicaragua? So this is looking at Nicaragua travel and tourism. And here we are at 2022. And what's being projected is this increase right, in these package holidays, right? People being able to go and have an experience of doing yoga on the beach, learning how to surf, going horseback riding, bicycling, visit a volcano, hike a mountain, go across a lake, having these types of destination vacations, but very nature-based, right? And we're starting to see an increase. So this is kind of just, some views of what that looks like, to have that type of vacation lifestyle. So it's interesting because it's not like, Marriott or Hilton or Holiday Inn, right? Those businesses are not in this region. A lot of it's still local development or local hybrid, right? A foreigner who's working with a local. But foreigners can also own land in this country. It's very easy. And some of these larger resorts are 100% foreign owned. Okay? So there's a real mix in how that development's happening. And what I'm going to do now is turn this over to Jason, who's really spent a lot more time than me going in and deeply studying Nicaragua. And he recently presented his doctoral thesis, based on the politics of waves, right? His experiences working in Nicaragua. So Jason, I'm going to let you jump in and just let me know when to advance the slide, and then once we're done, I'll put on the pictures so you can see the faces of everybody behind the presentations. Is that good?
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, well, first, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to anybody who's out there. I don't know who's out there, but thank you to whoever you are, and to those of you, of course, on Zoom with us. I'm checking in down from Tampa, Florida. But yeah, as Tamara said, oh hey everybody. Yeah, so I titled this "The Politics of Waves," and I'm going to try to be pretty brief because I know Lindsay's also got a lot of awesome stuff to talk about. But I titled it that because of how political things got as I was doing my research. So it just felt, like a good title for it. And I'm going to get in brief. I'll give a brief run through of some of the legislation that over the course of the last, since basically 1990, that has created an environment conducive to foreign investment and even frameworks to handle it. And so I'm just going to run through that. So if you want to go to the next slide, Tamara, this is I guess I'd call it my study site. It's the same. I'm not going to step on Lindsay's toes, but it's the same area. We both study this area, and everybody calls it Popoyo. And if you still remember what that map looked like that Tamara showed you, it's within the same department that Tamara's study site is in. She's in San Juan del Sur, and I'm in. It's all in the department of Rivas, which is the southwestern part of Nicaragua. And so what everybody calls this place Popoyo is actually Playa Sardina. There is an actual Playa Popoyo, which is just south of there, walking distance south. But nevertheless, I will, and I imagine Lindsay will as well, refer to this area as Popoyo or Popoyo Reef. But at least I'm going to, just so everybody knows. And you can do the next slide.
Yeah, and what I love, Jason, in this one is how you have the picture of the wave and you can see that wind pushing it back. Right? You see the spray flying
Nica has a very special situation with waves. It's one of the most consistent surf breaks or surf areas that I've been to, and I've been around the world surfing, and it has virtually all year long offshore winds, which makes for optimal surfing conditions. So the combination of pretty consistent swell and wonderful winds and a variety of waves packed into a small space makes for a very optimal place for surf tourism. And we'll talk about sort of the political conditions and legislation that helped to facilitate that environment. So you can move along to the next slide if you want. So my purpose really in this presentation, and just kind of more broadly with my research, is to trace Popoyo's evolution from a rural coastal periphery to an international surfing epicenter. And keep in mind, this place, I'll talk a little bit more about it on the next slide, was a rural periphery in Nicaragua reserved largely for agriculture, the agro industry, so cattle and farming and all of that. And so there was no real surf culture to speak of, like you had, for example, in the Hawaiian Islands with the arrival, when white Calvinist missionaries and businessmen arrived. And so Nika this was a sport that was introduced by foreigners. So, like I said, it was very much a periphery. It wasn't an epicenter at the time. It was very much a periphery that was reserved for agriculture and the agro-industry. And so the other purpose, briefly, is to show how surfing shifts from an activity that was practiced exclusively by affluent Nicaraguans and foreigners to a national sport dominated by the underprivileged inhabitants or the economically disadvantaged inhabitants of these coastal pueblos. And so, when it was introduced, again, this is something I'll talk about on the next slide, it was very much practiced by affluent Nicaraguans, those that were connected to the United States at the time of the surf boom, let's say, the 60s, 70s, and even later. But they were sort of within that orbit of the, in contact with the U.S., some of which went to school there. But again, I'll get into that in the next slide. And then over time, I think for me, the most interesting arc to the story is that it went from something introduced by foreigners and practiced by affluent Nicaraguans to now in 2023, a sport undeniably dominated by the economically disadvantaged youth and now young adults of this coastal area. So you can, Tamara, if you go to the next slide, I'll do a little quick background. I think, I can't see too well who's out there, but I'm assuming most of us out there remember that at least the 80s, and perhaps even a little later. But just to give you guys a really, really brief run through to contextualize all of this, what Tamara's just talked about and what Lindsay's going to talk about, and sort of set us up for the legislation I'm going to talk about next. So the first surfers in Nicaragua, the first Nicaraguan surfer, known Nicaraguan surfer, really started in the early 60s, Arturo Molieri. And he worked with Pan Am. So again, he was within that sort of, Pan Am Airlines was going from Managua to LA, Managua to Miami, and so he was kind of swept up into that surf buzz that was taking place in the United States in the 60s with, just the endless summer type movies, the Beach Boys, just everything that was surrounding sort of California surf culture, and I don't have time to go into all those details, but I think, even up there in Vermont, you guys are familiar with it. And then there was a small cohort of surfers through, say, the 60s and 70s. Again, those that were involved were very much affluent and or foreigners. An individual that I became friends with, Jack Crockett, his father was the ambassador from the U.S. to Nicaragua from 67 to 70. So that gives you a sense of the type of individuals that were, frequenting somewhere like Nicaragua. So again, there was no surf culture to speak of. It was not a heavily trafficked surf spot at that time. It was, again, just people, and for the most part, exploring. Then you have the Sandinista Revolution of 1979, which was brought about major change in Nicaragua, deposed a 43-year-long backed U.S. dictatorship, and ushered in a socialist democracy that brought about massive land reforms, such as the agrarian reform, and a whole host of other things that, like I said, I won't go into, at least for this presentation. If there's questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them. As I said, many of you are familiar with what took place throughout the 80s with the U.S.-backed counterinsurgency funded by the United States and other countries, but largely the Reagan administration. But during that time, that cohort of individuals that we were taught, that I was mentioning, some of them, not all, some had actually left the country, but that picture you see in the bottom middle is a small cohort, largely Nicaraguans, affluent Nicaraguans. There's one Guatemalan in there, but largely Nicaraguans that were affluent, that were actually surfing at Popoyo against the backdrop of this really bloody conflict. And just to give you a bit of a sense of how close it was, newspaper articles from that time put it in and around the Las Salinas area, which is Las Salinas to Popoyo, Playa Sardina, is not very far, a couple miles maybe. And so in the hills there were skirmishes, and they were documented in the newspapers. So again, these individuals were able to navigate the draft and navigate a whole host of other things and go surf at Popoyo. This included them shooting with Tani, which was a cigarette company, a Nicaraguan cigarette company. They shot a cigarette commercial at the beach there in, I think, 1983. So again, just to kind of create this context for you all. A real odd juxtaposition, really, this bloody conflict with, people surfing the beaches. And so, and then all that comes to an end in 1990 with the election of Violeta Chamorro and the UNO. It was a coalition, but the UNO party, it was very much backed by the United States, supported by the United States, and that then ushers in what I'm going to talk to on the next slide, which is really the beginning of legislation that created an environment welcoming to foreign direct investment. So, go ahead and move along. Sorry if I'm talking quickly. I'm trying to, squeeze all this in for you guys. And don't worry, I'm not going to read all these and give you the definitions of them all. But what I want us to look at is really, Tamara broke this down into 3 sections. So thank you for doing that. If you look at the first sort of section there, the first 4, they're all laws tailored towards tourism. 91, you have the law of foreign investment, which is what it sounds like. It created an environment that was welcoming for foreign direct investment to incentivize people. Obviously, 1991, people weren't busting down the gates to get into Nicaragua because of, the war had just ended and there was reticence and apprehension because people thought it was still dangerous. And then by 95, Nicaragua joins the World Trade Organization. And by 98, 99, the Institute of Tourism is recreated. That it did exist under the Sandinistas, but for different reasons. But this was outward facing. In other words, it was targeting foreigners and welcoming them to sort of come and join in this new initiative to bolster a tourism economy. And then you see the law there, the tourism incentive law, which was incentives for people, foreigners that were to start, and locals, to start tourism-related businesses. And so that was an incentive by Arnoldo Alemán, who was president at the time. And then, again, as you can see, really more of the same in the sense that the successor, Alemán's successor, or Alemán and his successor, were still crafting policies to really court foreign capital and get people to come to Nicaragua to invest, to buy property. And as we move through that decade, the 2000s, Tamara mentioned this briefly, but Daniel Ortega wins again. He was the president he was involved heavily from 79 to 90, president formally from 85 with Sergio Ramirez. To 85 to 90, but wins is re-elected. The Sandinistas are re-elected in 2006, and then begins to pass legislation to create a framework to handle this growing tourism economy. And as Tamara mentioned, water insecurity, that's still a big issue. And so you see the water law, and then you see the law to develop a coastal zone. That's to mitigate privatization, because people were buying and building developments and trying to recreate a new Costa Rica, if you will. And that comes with its positives and negatives. And part of that was the privatization of the coastline. And of course the water insecurity. So, and then you had the Special Potable Water Committee in line with the framework to mitigate water insecurity, which is, as I said, still an issue in 2023. Because tourism is expanding. And so as we move into the 2010s, this is when the Emerald Coast, which Tamara mentioned, gets its name. It is very much branded as this idea for tourism. And so Tola, the municipality, basically the whole area starts to brand itself, Tola in particular, as the surfing municipality. And you then see 2016, 19, and 20, legislation passed by the National Assembly to not only acknowledge that surfing is a growing sport among locals, but to create frameworks for Nicaraguan Federation of Surfing. AmSurf Tola is more of a local municipality branch of a surfing organization, and then by 2020, FedeSurf Nica is the Federation of Nicaraguan Federation of Surfing, which was kind of a rebranding of Finnish Surf. So again, you can see this trajectory, you can see the evolution. By 2005, again, as tourism is expanding, locals are gaining access to surfing equipment, those that were within that orbit of the surf tourism industry. And they begin to surf and really become quite proficient in the sport. And by 2005, there's enough to hold a local contest at Pacoya, and you can see a number of the participants. The lady in white with the hat on, Loida Garcia, was actually the mayor of Tola at the time. So again, you're starting to see buy-in from local officials even as early as, 2005. So coming out in support. All right. By 2013, again, Ortega's been president since roughly, late 2006. This was a major milestone for Nicaraguan surfing because it, by this point, had enough infrastructure to host major international events, such as the International Surfing Association events. It hosted the Masters, which is for the older surfers, actually. And then by 2000, it then hosted the 2013 is hosting the juniors, which was the young surfers. But the point of this is to show that Daniel Ortega is sitting there with Fernando Aguirre, who is the president of the International Surfing Association. So you're seeing this collaboration, if you will, or buy-in from the highest-ranking officials in the country. So, of course, they see surfing as a way to generate revenue. And by this point, it's one of the biggest contributors to tourism, and tourism is one of the biggest contributors to overall revenue. So it piqued their interest for a whole host of reasons. Next slide. Yeah, so that's the city center of Tola, and that, as you can see right inside the O, it's rebranded. It's got a surfer getting barreled or kind of getting barreled, and again, they rebranded themselves as a surfing municipality, and rightly so. It was extremely popular by this time. But I do want to, I'm trying to be cognizant of time. I do want to make mention of something that I'm not the only one that uses this term, but surf settler colonialism. That really implies, it is what it sounds like, and that is foreigners colonizing these spaces. And with that, while we can celebrate some of the strides in tourism, we also want to be realistic about the other things that are taking place, such as legal marginalization, displacement, and a whole host of other things that are negatively affecting the local population. And I won't step on Lindsay's toes because that's her world, and I'll let her talk about that. But again, just to be clear, there are positives and negatives, and we want to, as scholars and academics, we want to make note of those as well and be critical of tourism in its, as a whole. So that's certainly one that is something I talk about in my research. But again, through that surf settler colonialism, locals gained access to surf equipment. And so I want to be careful not to romanticize them, but again, we want to be cognizant of the pros and the cons. But nevertheless, by 2020, surfing in Nicaragua had very much deep roots. I don't know if you can move that little column thing there.
Oh, actually, we don't see it.
Oh yeah, can you just click?
Well, that goes into Lindsay's.
Back now? Now go back.
Let's see.
Yeah, and I just read this because it's really the end of my dissertation. But by 2020, surfing in Nicaragua had established deep roots. The surfing look that when you think about like an American surfer, say from California or Florida or whatever, that look with its brand name board shorts, its thong flip-flops, surfer t-shirts, and the shaka hand gesture had undoubtedly permeated all areas of this once overlooked rural coastal periphery. And so just in short, large tracts of land once owned by terratenientes, which is large landowners, that was reserved for raising cattle, had become subdivisions for expatriates and tourism communities. Property that had been redistributed during the Reforma Agraria, or the agrarian reform, for farming and agriculture had become riddled with vacation rentals for travel and tourists. Beaches, once frequented predominantly by local fishermen and of course their families, have become cultural contact zones for consuming cervezas, soaking in the views, and wave riding. And so with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Lindsay.
Hi everyone, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me as well, and I will try to be brief because I know we've been here a while. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I have done in Nicaragua, which has been a decade now since I did it. And so I, when I was doing my stuff was really, it was a few years after Ortega had gotten back into power, and most of the foreigners had realized that everything was going to be fine and they weren't going to be booted out. And so it was really kind of the search scene in the Popoyo area was really kind of growing a lot at that time. So if you want to go to the next slide, that's fine. So I'm actually going to talk more about Las Salinas, which is really the community that's closest to Popoyo, and it's an indigenous community. And they are designated as an indigenous community, and they do not speak an indigenous language, but they have communal land, and they pass that down through their family, and there are very special rules that govern that land. And it's about a kilometer walk to Popoyo from this community, and through that area are salt fields. And so one of the major things that community does is they cultivate salt, and it's kind of crude salt for animals and stuff like that. It's not really like, it wouldn't be refined for consumption usually. And so it's kind of a unique sort of geography when you're there, and that's kind of where my work took place. So with my first study, I was there over sort of the holidays, really, of 2009, 2010. And I did interviews with residents of Las Salinas. I think it was about, I want to say between 20 and 25 folks, men, women, younger, older, that sort of thing, people who worked in tourism, people who didn't. And I just asked them a lot of questions about different dimensions of quality of life. And one of the things that came out was that many of them were becoming more reliant upon tourism. So a lot of the men worked in construction, building new tourism development in some of the beaches further down, some of the gated communities, but also in an area near Popoyo known as Playa Huasacate. And a lot of the foreign development took place there because that was not indigenous land. And in sort of the inland, sort of the hilly area just beyond Playa Huasacate was where a lot of gringo homes were being built and that sort of thing. So it's interesting sort of hearing the community perspective. One of the big complaints was that, a lot of tourism work was very seasonal. And so the time I was there, a lot of people didn't have work because if they worked as housekeeping staff or frontline staff, there was no one there. And so, there were no tourists there at the time. A lot of the foreigners that owned places would go home to the States for the holidays. And so that was sort of the first study that I did just to kind of figure out, sort of how people's quality of life there is and whether tourism plays a role in that. And so you can go on to the next slide there. One of the interesting things that came out, and I did talk to some surfers because there are quite a few members of the community who are surfers. And now many of them are actually teaching their children to surf, which is really interesting. And so many of them were surfers, and one of them had mentioned, they were like, yeah, sometimes there will be conflicts with, in the surf. And so I was like, well, this is interesting, because this is a phenomenon in surfing called localism. And you may have heard this stuff in California and Hawaii, where people have gotten beat up over trying to surf a surf break, and they are told by locals they can't, and that sort of thing. It's a very, very basic definition of it. But it's basically this idea of like territoriality over a surf break by surfers. And so when that surfer mentioned that, I was like, oh, I wonder if this is an issue here. And so that's really what I chose to explore for my dissertation. So I was there for about 2 months, and I really looked at, how does this territoriality manifest at the surf break, and how is local surfer identity defined? Like, we have all these expats here, do locals consider them locals? And that was kind of something that came out as I started doing my research, is that was kind of a later thing, and I asked them, I was like, well, are those people locals? But then I went to a few of the foreigners and I asked them, but I didn't explore that as much with the expat as I did with the local community. And it was really interesting what happened there, because how they would sort of demonstrate ownership over the surf break was very different than how we may see other surfers do that. And I think a big part of that reason was their reliance on tourism. They're like, yeah, I love to share my territory, which is the waves. Like, I'm happy to share that, but you need to follow the rules. And they would tell me, the rules of surfing, and those were aligned with most of the other, rules of surfing that we're familiar with worldwide. But it was interesting that even watching them when I was in the surf break, they would do things like show dominance by dropping in on others and that sort of thing to show that they were a local. And the biggest conflict, the violent conflict that would come out, was actually expats. And so some locals had actually had conflicts with expats, and expats had had conflicts with tourists. And so it was really interesting that the expats had kind of taken on this role of sort of the more aggressive local, instead of the indigenous residents. And so that was really interesting. And another thing about the local identity, local surfer identity, was that people said, surfers, expat surfers who have helped the community, we consider them to be local surfers. But expats who haven't helped the local community, they're not local surfers. And so that was fascinating to me, to kind of hear about that. And that's very tied to indigenous identity, this idea of reciprocity. And you could see that they had really integrated that into their definition of being a local surfer and what that meant to them. And so I'll go ahead and stop there. Those are kind of the 2 studies I did, and I have the publications listed there. Thank you for your time.
Oh, great. What I'm going to do now, thanks everyone. So, but let's open this up to questions. So also folks who are online, if you have questions, you can definitely ask. Now we can see everybody. All right, so there we have Jason. Big shout out to Jason here. Let's see if I can get him on the big screen. All right, so thanks for sharing with us. And let's see. Oh, and here's Lindsay. We'll put Lindsay on the big screen. All right, so hi, Lindsay. All right, and so questions. Does anyone have questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really enjoyed these presentations. My question is about infrastructure, and one of the things that I noticed when I was visiting Tamara in Nica is, the roads that connect these different beaches are really, they're really not in great repair. They're, you need a 4x4, it's very bouncy. It's like, in Vermont we call it a washout, like it would be regraded, it would be fixed up. And I know there's a lot of discussion about, I don't know, maybe paving it, maybe, just bringing it so it would be a lot more accessible. And there's already so many Europeans, gringos around. I'm curious how much discussion there is around, if it was made even more accessible, there could be just a massive influx of tourists that would dwarf, what we're seeing right now. So I'm wondering if anybody can talk about that.
I was asking about was the development, right, and the roads, and what's the deal with the rural roads and the dirt roads? I don't know if it's like that by Popoyo, but, you know, four-wheel drive, you know, a motorcycle is the only way to really get to where we are. And I know there's a project that's been on the books forever for building a road all across that whole Emerald Coast area that's paved, right? But right now we don't have that, and she's just wondering what's your guys' take on that? You know, rough roads, hinder, help.
I'm happy to answer that unless you guys want to. Lindsay, I don't know if you want to.
I mean, go ahead, and, I mean, I can add anything, so.
So the promise of that road is kind of ongoing. But on the south side, you know, this has been now maybe 10 years-ish. It's really been in and around the time that the Emerald Coast Airport was really, you know, fully operational. The south side, from say the Tola area, moving north towards part of, not even to Popoyo. That was done with what they called like adoquines, which are sort of pavers essentially. So they use pavers to make that all the way through essentially one of Hacienda Iguana, which is one of a number of developments there. It's right beside that airport. And so the promise to build the rest of it, which would run through where Lindsay's talking about Las Salinas, and that way, and then through what they call the Ochomogo Trail or Ochomogo Road, has always been, there's been lots and lots of talk about it. So about 2 years ago now, more or less, sort of post 2018, because there was a lot of political unrest there, 18, 19. So post that, they did start doing work on it, and I don't know that it's complete yet, but they are, putting the adoquines all the way through Las Salinas. So they started by flattening it to make it, you know, able to put those there, and then the rain always comes and destroys it. But they have pretty much been working on it finally. And this is even amidst the political unrest and things like that. The Ortega government has been pretty adamant about doing it. And so it's...
And they're, just to clarify, they're kind of like bricks.
Yeah.
Is what Jason is talking about. Like, it's not literally pavement. Like, it's these bricks, and it's kind of like they sort of fit together like Legos. And so it just makes it a little more... It's not quite the same as a paved road, but that's what they are. Yeah,
and it really, it's a pretty major undertaking by the Sandinista government, because the FSLN is the government in charge, to make it easier for people to get to the Popoyo area, to Tola. So, I mean, it's, again, as I said, it has been branded as a surfing municipality, so that you do see finally these efforts being made to facilitate that. Are the roads good? I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I certainly I'm not going to say whether it's good or bad. All I know is a lot of people are excited, but it's also, they've done things like, what's the word? We call it here where, like, you want to take land, it's
eminent domain.
Eminent domain. So they've kind of done like sort of an eminent domain type thing as well to make sure it's wide. And so again, I don't, that's probably for another discussion. But to answer your question, yes, there is a project underway to make it paved, and I'd have to ask my friends there if they're finished yet. So hopefully that answered your question.
And I mean, another thing I'll say that I feel like Costa Rica faces the same issue as well is that in tropical countries, it is very hard to pave roads and not have to deal with potholes all the time. So honestly, having the little bricks or having a dirt road that you maintain is almost better, because then that's just easier to navigate than having a paved road that you've got to navigate potholes all the time. I mean, because this is the same thing in Costa Rica. Like, it's either a dirt road or a paved road with a ton of potholes. And so, they're just fighting the elements due to the rainy and dry season of, where they are. And so I think that's, a big issue.
Listen, you
Yeah,
wanna come
and
up?
to her point, you can easily fix them. So like, you'll see a section that they've pulled up, and then they go in and fix them, so, all right. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, we have the same problems here in Vermont. But I was curious, Lindsay, when you said that the indigenous locals had a sort of a different way of looking at expats who helped. And I'm curious in what ways expats help. And in general, I mean, one of my preoccupations about investing or going in a country like Nicaragua is local resentment. I mean, ways that the tourists are getting a better deal than the folks are locally, whether it's because a better road is being put in to help tourism as opposed to, areas that the locals might use more, or is it kind of something that just lifts all boats? So that would be my question.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not, I mean, I guess I'll address the lifting all boats thing. I mean, I think, it's providing employment, but the problem with the foreign development laws that Jason was talking about is that basically those privilege foreign investment over local development. And so it's very difficult for locals to compete with that, to say, start their own businesses and that sort of thing. Granted, by this point, some of them have managed to do that in the Popoyo area. The Popoyo area is very different from where Tamara is talking about. The Wi-Fi is not good, like the electricity is not great. There's a lot of foreign ownership of the surf infrastructure, business ownership, and that sort of thing, but you're starting to see more local ownership, but it's not as much. And so to describe that a little bit more, one of the interesting things about Las Salinas and Wasacate and that area is like, there's been quite a bit of intermixing of kind of the foreign population and the local population. So there's several women that have married into the indigenous, like gringo women, who have married into the indigenous community. There's gringos who have married women in the indigenous community. And so and those folks tended to help out not only the families they've married into, but also the community. And so they've done things like, brought in medical clinics or, done murals or, provided little art classes for kids or, other things for the school. There's a foundation that an Argentinian woman and her U.S. husband have started that they have a little library. And so they, they work with the school and, they provide internet access for the community and that sort of thing. There was a Mexican woman who, her and her French partner, they would repair locals' boards for free. And because of that, and she had even tried to teach some of the Nica girls to surf. And so because of that kind of involvement and assistance and integration in the local community, those are the people that, at least the surfing expatriates, they were like, those people we consider local surfers, because they have given back to us, they have helped us. So that's what I mean when I say, helping, is that contributing to the community.
Can I add one example, just kind of piggybacking on what Lindsay was saying? A lot of the, I'm going to give an example of a friend who, longtime friend, Lindsay knows him as well. He worked at one of the surf camps, and his wife, who's I believe she's Canadian, but very, very long story short, his younger brother, I'm pretty sure it's his brother. I should know that, but she's now, because he's one of the best surfers around. They have been able to because he's one of the best surfers on the national team, but doesn't have the means to go compete in these international contests. So she has been able to, because of her sort of access to the U.S. and Canada, et cetera, launching campaigns with like GoFundMe and things like that to sort of help him go do these things, because otherwise it would just become, it'd be impossible, nearly impossible. So that collaboration that Lindsay's talking about has, I would say, probably grown since she was doing her research in some respects.
I'm just curious, I was in Costa Rica in 2018, 2019, and during that period, they said, oh, don't go to Nicaragua. I was dying to go, and they said, don't go to Nicaragua. It's you know, it's dangerous, blah, blah, on and on and on. And I'm just curious, what was going on that would make them talk about that? And if it was it serious, or were they overblowing it, or that sort of thing? Number one. Number two, the water temperature was in the mid-80s in northern Costa Rica. Is that true in Nicaragua also?
I'd be happy to answer, well, I guess both. I could do the 2018 one for sure. So again, very much long story short, by 2018, I will say this, prior April 18, 2018, which is what I'm going to address, Nicaragua was arguably one of the safest countries in Latin America, right? And again, I won't go into details as to why, but nevertheless, by April of 2018, a number of things took place. One, the Nicaraguan government made changes to the Social Security reform, and that obviously had a negative impact on the elderly folks who were going to be drawing off retirement. And so that led to a protest, small protest in the beginning, by students at a local university there in Managua. And at that time, a young 15, I think it was 15, was shot by government forces. And so that led to an eruption in Nicaragua. And people were already there was a growing concern about sort of the direction of the Sandinista government. And some people very much were in favor, others were not. And those that were not made their voices known at that point. And there was also some other things going on in one of the protected areas, a reserve, where there was it was sort of, land was being burnt there, trees were being burned, so people were upset about that too. And so it was really a culmination of a whole host of things that, you know, that kid being, you know, murdered in cold blood was essentially the last straw. It was the match that set the country ablaze. Was it dangerous? I would say for a time, it was certainly not a place that was, you know, you would want to take your family, because virtually every major city, Granada, Leon, Managua, it was clashes between people who had grievances with the government, and then the government doing what the government needed to do, or at least what they thought they needed to do to quell this unrest. And so, yeah, I mean, the Pan American Highway was paralyzed because people put roadblocks. I mean, for a time, it was pretty heavy. And so, the rumors you were hearing in Costa Rica, I think, were valid. And so a lot of people, I think Tamara mentioned this earlier, a lot of people left at that time. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so, again, that's for a whole other conversation, because I could go on and on about that situation. But, of course, Costa Rica, you know, people were hearing it in Costa Rica. But I would say by about 2019, I was there then. And again, inside what Tamara kept calling the Emerald Coast, Tola, and maybe even, you know, some of those sorts, it's a bubble. So you were in this sort of foreign bubble. And so while things were taking place outside that bubble, inside that bubble, and this is the case for COVID too, by the way, people were doing their thing, yoga, drinking beers and rum and surfing. And so, again, inside that bubble, it was business as usual, including surf websites and others saying, hey, everything's good now. Whereas CNN and other news channels were saying, do not go to Nicaragua, and that includes the U.S. Embassy. So you really have two worlds going on simultaneously.
Thanks.
Do you want to do the water temperature, Lindsay?
Well, I will say that there is probably more upwelling in Nicaragua due to the offshore winds. So it is not always as warm as what I have experienced in Costa Rica. So it can get quite chilly, actually.
I've had it in the, I would say upper 60s. Like I was wearing,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that's not cold for you guys up in Vermont by any stretch, but you know, I was wearing a 2 mil short john, which is a short sleeve, long leg wetsuit that was 2 mil in Nicaragua. So I'd say the water at its peak was probably in the mid to upper 60s.
And you also mentioned that there was water issues with potable water. How do you see tourism development impacting the future of water usage in Nicaragua?
I can talk about what's happening right now in my region, but I don't know if you have.
Yeah, Tamara, go ahead, and Lindsay and I can tackle the total area.
All right, what I can talk about too, and also from the roads and the development, it's sort of interesting because that project, they're resurrecting it again. You know, we're building this road from Costa Rica down to Managua, right, along the coastal region. And they're already starting the same thing, like, you know, so choosing tracts of land, you know, whether it's owned by someone or not, deciding that's going to be part of the road. And it was interesting because a lot of the expats, we have a lot of Facebook groups that the expats all speak on, right? And when I say expats, that means like the foreign landowners or people that have kind of like made their second home, Nicaragua. And so they're a very active community, and they were upset. Like there's a lot of like, oh my goodness, what are they going to do? It's not going to be developed properly. It's going to overrun the natural areas. Where are the monkeys going to go? You know, what's going to happen? This is all going to become like a strip with McDonald's. And, you know, is there any kind of controls being put on this big paved highway that's going to be going along the coastal areas? Because one of the things that's always kept the coastal areas kind of, you know, cultural has been those dirt roads.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, taxis can't go out there, and, you know, people that aren't adventurous are afraid. So it's kept that local culture, and, you know, people who are more adventurous, right, in those regions, like that surfing region. So there was kind of, but meanwhile the locals were saying, oh, we'd love to have a paved road. It'll bring more business, it'll bring more money, more opportunity. We're fine with that, right? They're not concerned about the monkeys and the environment, but they haven't really seen a lot of the development like we've seen, you know, as foreigners. Yeah, where we've seen, some of them have been to Costa Rica because that is an easy place to work in. But, you know, they don't really understand the negatives of development as much as we do. So that was an interesting thing. The other thing is the water. You know, as people are building more and more up into the hills, and, you know, I've only been in Nicaragua for 2 years now, and in the 2 years I've been there, I bought an existing home. But I've already seen like 4 tracts of land just in the little quarter-mile piece from my house to the beach being sold and developed, you know, and beautiful trees cut down and gigantic houses being built, and they're foreign owned. You know, and a lot of these, I have an aquifer where I am, but a lot of the houses up in the hills don't. You know, and the question is, how long is that aquifer going to last for, and what is the water flow, and how deep is it? And nobody knows these things. They all just say, oh, it's a good aquifer. But, you know, more and more houses are being built. There's a big hotel. There's multiple hotels now. There's Salinas, which is this international hostel. You know, they'll have maybe, you know, 30 people there at any given part of the day. And the sewage we're not so sure about, right? It looks like some of their sewage is spilling out into the street. It's been reported to the local, you know, the alcalde, the mayor. But, you know, there's not a lot of agency amongst the locals. You have to wait for the elected officials to do whatever they do. And you have to wait patiently. That's part of the politics there. So that's been something that's, you know, people just don't know how the development's going to be. They don't know how the water's going to be. There's already trucks that'll go and fill cisterns for people, because people will buy houses and build them up in the hills not realizing that there's no water there. And they have to have a cistern that's filled. And of course everybody wants a swimming pool. and everyone wants electricity and air conditioning. So we're starting to think about how is that gonna start stressing the grid? Like, has there been any assessment done on this? So we're not sure. I don't know if you guys have more information on that.
Lindsay, do you want to talk about it real quick?
I mean, all I can say is like, you cannot drink the water there. I mean, like, I've been in places in Costa Rica where they chlorinated the water, you can drink it, whatever, but like, at least like where I stay with a family in a community, and you cannot drink that water. You have to drink like bottled water. And I mean, some of the resorts, they have their own water systems and stuff like that, where they purify the water and that sort of thing, but like in terms of the community, like, they can't drink the water. And so,
Is it
but I
because of
think
bacteria? Why can't they drink it? Because we
oh
drink
yeah,
water.
I mean, I got giardia, and I wasn't
Oh.
drinking the water
Okay.
during the rainy season. Yeah, I mean, most of like the global south, you can't drink the water. Like that's not, yeah, it's just not safe. So, that's kind of how it is. But Jason, I know in your dissertation, you talked about water access, I guess in, was it Iguana or one of the places? But you can go ahead and know more about that than I do, so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it a little bit ago, you guys, about the water laws, and it was an attempt to mitigate this, and it's still, again, this is a major problem. You have, and by the way, I am not, the leading scholar on this. There's a number of people doing work on this. Matthew Taylor, Thomas Labanchi, Sarah Romano, they're doing really, really good work on water insecurity in Gigante and kind of Tola more broadly. But yeah, it's a real issue, and one of the major problems, and again, I should be clear and say that I'm an active participant in this. I've owned land there since 2004, and so I just want to be kind of transparent about that. I have a botanical gardens where I have a group of people there. We do have a family that works with me there, but so I am guilty of this, and I say that because one of the major problems is foreigners and tourism who are drawing from that aquifer Tamara is talking about and drying up the wells. And what's happening is the local population who use wells, they don't have the sort of tourism infrastructure, water systems. Their wells become salty, and so and that that's a big deal because they do everything with those wells. And so that's one of the reasons way back in the late 2000s that the Ortega government was making efforts to mitigate this impending problem that still continues to be a problem because tourism is growing. As tourism is growing and people are building and wanting to water their lawns and take long, unnecessary showers, they're pulling on that water system that, like I said, Matt, Thomas, and Sarah are writing about, and kind of waving their hands and saying, this is going to come to an end, because once that water's gone, tourism will, pun intended, I suppose, will dry up.
All right, and I think we're pretty much at the end of our time, so I want to thank you guys for coming and sharing your expertise and years of experience with surfing in Nicaragua with us. It's been such a treat hearing from you. And I want to thank everyone for coming, including our online guests, and taking an interest in a different part of the world. Now, if people continue to have questions or anything, just reach out to Windham World Affairs Council. We'll give you, emails if that's okay, or answer questions, and maybe we'll see you down in Nicaragua at some point.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Be on this panel with these two awesome women, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.